Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Albums Only podcast, a very spooky edition, I should say, because this is our Halloween special edition. We're taking a little break from the normal canon of albums and bringing you something that is more in line with the holiday season. My name is Jacob Slater, the internet's own Frankenstein, and with me, as always, is podcast's very own Dracula, Alan Beavers. And what album are we going to be covering for this Halloween? Well, we're going for a little band that's close to my heart. I've talked about it throughout this podcast. It's Primus and their 1993 album Pork Soda, so-called the strangest album to ever reach the top 10. Certainly true. When it was released, it reached number 7 on the Billboard Top 10 for rock albums, which is a pretty crazy thing to think about. Just when you listen to Primus and to think that many people picked up their album. So, yeah, this is our pick for the Halloween season, and I think it's definitely appropriate. I think if you listen to the lyrics, you listen to the album, which you might after we talk about it, you'll find that it's a very dark album, deals with a lot of very dark themes. Not too strange for Primus, but I think of all the Primus albums, this one is definitely the darkest. And, I'm going to be talking about how I kind of discovered Primus, but first, Alan, where did you first learn about Primus?
My first exposure was probably in the 6th or 7th grade on a bus trip. I think other people were playing Eminem. And whatever version of My Name Is by Eminem that has the "Hi, my name is, hi kids, do you like Primus? Want to see me stick 9-inch nails to each one of my eyelids?" I had no idea what that was until I was informed that Primus was a band. But from there, I think maybe the next time that I'd really listened to them was South Park. And they did do the opening song on South Park. And so some of my exposure is primarily in that way, and then Tony Hawk's Pro Skater came out. I know that's a big way that a lot of people were exposed to some of their work. Jerry was a race car driver. John the Fisherman also appeared on, I think, one of the Guitar Heroes or rock bands. So that's sort of my exposure with Primus. I've always sort of had a fascination with them since then because they are so unique in so many ways. I'm sure you have a much more interesting story about how you were exposed to them. Please do tell, Jacob.
Well, I think people who've listened to this show enough times know by now that I was a very kind of sheltered person originally. I was not really exposed to all that much music. And so a lot of the bands that I've grown to love, I discovered through Guitar Hero. I've name-dropped Guitar Hero so many times over this podcast, but Guitar Hero 2 featured a track by Primus, John the Fisherman, and it was just one of those cases where it was a bit like how I discovered Jimi Hendrix through a Verizon commercial. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before in the way that children do, I guess, that you just discover something that completely changes how you look at things. And as someone who was very interested in weird comic books and weird books and weird movies and stuff like that, it always seemed natural to me to kind of drift into weird music as well.
Can I just say that I think it's really interesting. You mentioned that how you're exposed to certain types of music, and I think sometimes that can ruin it for you. Sometimes it can be a great exposure. It can be a Guitar Hero. Sometimes it can be, the California Raisins singing "I Heard It Through the Grapevine." And to be honest with you, something like that kind of ruins it for me. I grew up having heard that when I was young, and then not really wanting to have anything to do with that song or even that sort of sound because I just thought it was kind of kitschy and commercial. It can be a negative thing, I think, in some circumstances, but it can also be an amazingly positive thing because once that commercial is done and you stop hearing it for the 600th time, you can kind of divorce yourself from that and move on and truly appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah, and this was right around the time where YouTube was getting started, and that actually helped a lot as well, just to be able to search for Primus after playing it on Guitar Hero 2. I remember one of the first Primus videos I ever saw, and I've talked about this to my friends a lot, but I haven't talked about it on the podcast. was a clip from Primus's set at Woodstock, I believe, 1994 Woodstock. And Les Claypool, the bassist and the leader of Primus, is playing the opening to Metallica's Master of Puppets, and he's doing it on the bass. And to just see him do it, just to see him, like, not using a pick like usually you see guitarists do, but to see it, like, him pounding it out, just seeing the speed and the dexterity with which he did it, I think that was, like, one of the moments where I was like, not just like with Geezer Butler and Black Sabbath, where I learned to appreciate the bass. I think it was that moment where I was like, I want to own a bass guitar. I want to do the things that he does with the bass guitar. And I actually ended up buying a bass guitar like a year or so later. Not any good with it. I can't play a lick, but that was like the power of Les Claypool and Primus for me, was to be able to see an instrument that I had never really even considered before to be played in such a way was like an astounding thing. And speaking of Metallica, there's a little bit of history that people always like to bandy about when talking about Primus. It was like way back in 1986, after the original bassist for Metallica, Cliff Burton, tragically died in a auto accident, I believe. Les Claypool was actually one of the people to audition for replacement bassist, because he actually had known guitarist Kirk Hammett ever since, I believe, high school. The common thing that James Hetfield always says is that Les Claypool was too good or too out there for Metallica, but it seems like Les Claypool's interpretation was that he wasn't really interested in being part of Metallica anyway. Like, he was doing it as a favor to Kirk. He wasn't really all that familiar with the metal scene in California at the time anyway, so...
That's interesting. I had never really heard that side of the story, particularly Les Claypool's version. And it makes sense. I mean, it's fun to imagine Les Claypool on Metallica, with Metallica, sort of where they would have went, but I kind of feel like maybe his genius and his ability to play wouldn't have been as well appreciated, and he wouldn't be able to do exactly what he wanted to do in so many ways.
Metal music as we know it, I think, has always been more of a guitar-centric genre, and Les Claypool was very much a bass-centric performer. It shows up in all of his works, so it's not quite a situation of like Richard Branson wanted to hire Johnny Rotten to front Devo or something like that. I feel like it was a lot less of a grand possibility. So let's take a little bit of a history lesson of Primus and Les Claypool. Originally, the band we know of as Primus originally started as Primate in El Sobrante, California, way back in 1984, composed of Les Claypool, guitarist Todd Huth, who would kind of continue in a guitarist capacity for a lot of the early Primus years, as well as a Lindrum drum machine, which is very, very crazy. Primus is kind of known throughout their career for a revolving cast of drummers. And to think that they started out with a drum machine as a drummer is, I don't know, there's something delightfully DIY about that. Just the thought of like, we don't have a drummer, so we're going to have to replicate drummer through technology.
I'm sure there's more than a few bands that have started out that way as well, so that's...
I mean, we even did a episode about them, Echo and the Bunnymen. Echo
Sure.
was the Echo drum machine, so we are not opposed to drum machines here at the Albums Only podcast.
Just drummers.
No drums here, please. As they became, and when they went from Primate to Primus, which I believe was, well, they had to change it because of legal reasons. I think the reason they chose Primus was because they opened a dictionary and they chose the word that was right next to Primus, or right next to Primate. So they're like, one down, Primus. Okay, there we go. Unfortunately, although this Huth, Claypool, Lane trio had a new name in Primus, the band was sure to suffer a little bit of hardships. Despite great success in the local scene at the time, actually, their concerts at Berkeley were known to be very popular. There were just too many issues, I guess you could say. Todd Hughes left the band to spend more time with his family. Jay Lane went back to play with his band, the Freaky Executives, after a kind of issue with them. And aside from a short-lived revival in 1994, the trio of Claypool, Hughes, and Lane recorded an album under the name Sausage, which was their demo way back then. And the album was called Riddles Are Bound Tonight. It's a very good album. Fortunately, Primus fell apart, and Les Claypool was forced to go back to his original band, Blind Illusion. However, it wasn't all bad, because it was with Blind Illusion that Les Claypool became friends with Larry Lalonde, who was a very great guitar player. He played not only with Blind Illusion, but with Possessed, and he was a student at one point of Joe Satriani, one of the great guitar virtuosos, and a former member of Frank Zappa's band in the late 70s, early 80s. With Larry Lalonde, Claypool grabbed Tim Alexander, popularly known as Herb, who was a drummer for an Arizona band named Major Lingo, and its trio that would ascend to superstar status. This was the classic Primus lineup. And it was with this lineup that they recorded their, I guess you could say, first album called Suck on This, a live album picked and chosen from several of their Berkeley concerts. And a year later, they released Frizzle Fry. It was a great album. It contained a lot of great songs, including John the Fisherman, which I was inspired by a few decades later. And it gained the attention of Interscope Records, who signed them after the release of this album. Was this period of time immediately after signing to Interscope Records that would see Primus ascend to its commercial and critical peak, I guess you could say. In 1991, they released Sailing the Seas of Cheese, their major label debut, and also their first album to reach gold status. 2 years later, we got Pork Soda, which was the so-called strangest top 10 album. And a couple years after that, we had Tales from the Punch Bowl. It's interesting because we talked about this a little bit. Band like Primus was so popular early 90s. Like, we're talking about a band that talked about guys doing meth and like a lot of weird and otherwise surreal stuff. This was a band that had great success. It had top 10 hits. It had Grammy nominations. I was wondering, Beeves, what you thought was the secret to Primus' success?
I think the phrase "at that time" is the critical part there. I think it's the 90s. It's the early to mid 90s where there was this sort of weirdness in the air. Grunge had taken hold, and there were all these spin-offs, and you had all these unique individuals and bands who had really broken through. And I just think a lot of it was because it was such a unique time in pop culture. When you had Lollapalooza, you had this sort of festival, almost carny-like niche scene going on, and Primus seemed to reflect that quite well. I think as an offshoot of grunge is sort of all the different kinds of songs, sounds, music that you had going on at the time. They all embraced one another and all sort of were inspired by each other to certain degrees. And I think Primus was the perfect example of a band that came along that sounded like no one else, but sounded unique, and was in a time when they could reach a really large audience in a way that you really can't do today. I mean, another thing to remember here too is this is a time when records and CDs and cassettes are in high demand. There is no internet streaming, not really until the mid and really the late 90s does that really take hold. And Primus got in there right before that boom of downloading the sort of, we still have the festival culture in America, festival music culture, but it had a larger reach at the time. It was able to reach more people. And I think youth culture was really still into that sort of rock grunge revival in the 90s, and that was so very important to it. Slater, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at the career or the trajectory of Primus, it kind of really speaks to kind of the changing moods of music goers in the 90s. I mean, in the late 80s, early 90s, you had this, Primus was in kind of the foundation of alternative music. I mean, this was a band that performed right alongside groups like Red Hot Chili Peppers and Faith No More and Jane's Addiction, kind of those big prime pre-grunge bands. So they had that going for them. And into the early 90s, the mid-90s, there was this kind of explosion of alternative music. You had a lot of people were getting into music. Labels were signing a whole bunch of bands that kind of went along with this kind of sound. Primus, because it had been kind of one of the early pioneers of that, got to ride along in that success. As the 90s went on and rock music kind of was starting to slowly fade away in favor of hip-hop music and electronic music, so too did you see kind of Primus's career wane. I mean, it wasn't about funk metal anymore, although you could argue that Primus isn't really funk metal. It was new metal now. It was metal and hip-hop, not metal and funk music. So
yeah, that's one of the most interesting things that we wanted to talk about, too, is what's Primus's sort of legacy in regards to new metal, the rise of Korn and bands like System of a Down and whatnot. And I think there's definitely something there, particularly not just in, I think, the bass, but more in the more mature themes of what you'd see with Primus. And also, ironically, I would venture to say, in Les Claypool's vocal delivery, which is so weird and skittish and sort of all over the place. And you look at other bands, other successors to that sound in certain ways, you're right, there's sort of a rapping connotation that a lot of bands take, a sort of rapping sound. But there's also that sort of skittish, Halloweenish, macabre quality in points that make you wonder the degree to which Les Claypool played a factor there.
You could definitely point to other bands at that time that kind of had a stronger kind of basic influence. Like you could say that Faith No More sounds a lot closer to like what new metal would eventually be than Primus does. Primus was one of those bands that inspired a lot of people. I mean, even one of the most direct examples is Limp Bizkit. Fred Durst was a big fan of Primus. Getting back to the history, after Tales from the Punch Bowl, Primus kind of went through a bit of a rough patch. They did eventually end up becoming the theme music for South Park, which was a huge deal when you consider how huge South Park was. They released the Brown album, which was a very good album, actually. I really enjoy it, but it didn't really progress the music, I guess you could say. It was very, very much in the vein of what you would expect Primus to do. And in 1998, I believe, or 1999, they released Anti-Pop, which, as I mentioned, featured production by Fred Durst as well as several other artists. And it seemed like it had fallen into a bit of a slump, even unless Claypool admits that around that time he had kind of, the well had run dry for him creatively. And in that same vein, it's one of the only Primus albums that I haven't actually listened to. I've heard a few tracks, but for some reason, Anti-Pop has never really grabbed to listen to it as much as the other Primus albums have. And it was after the release of Anti-Pop that there was a long period of, I mean, the band was still active. They still performed occasionally, but there wasn't really much in the way of studio material, aside from a kind of live album CD collection called Animals Should Not Try to Act Like People, which featured a couple of new tracks, including Mary the Ice Cube, which would feature on their 2004 Greatest Hits collection, They Can't All Be Zingers, which was
it's
the first...
great name for an album collection, by the way, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a great looking album, a great name for an album, and it was the first Primus material that I had ever actually owned.
It looks a lot like that cover. You're right. I love it's sort of a play on the Kraft Singles logo or product, so that's kind of a lot of fun too.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the track listing of that, it was, it was a lot more zingers than you'd expect. You had a lot of great material from their albums, but a lot from Frizzle Fry and Sowing the Seeds of Cheese and everything. There was, for a long time, not really much in the way of Primus material. A lot of side projects. Les Claypool would form a whole bunch of different side bands and work with a whole bunch of other people like Trey Anastasio and Buckethead and all these other people. And it wasn't until 2011 that we actually saw a proper Primus studio album released, which was Green Naugahyde, which was actually the first, well, I wouldn't say the first. It was the first Primus album that I actually got to play in studio at U92, actually. It was actually in I got to play with it. And it wasn't mind-blowing in the way that Pork Soda or Sowing the Seeds. It was a return to that great Primus sound in a lot of ways that I have been missing for so long. And since then, they've been fairly active, actually. They've released a couple of albums since then, Primus and the Chocolate Factory, which was their kind of reimagining, reinterpretation of the classic Willy Wonka movie. And just recently they released an album called The Desaturating Seven, which I believe they're touring for right now with a lot of stuff. So it was a long ride for this band. Like, issues at the beginning, then a quick meteoric rise, and then a kind of slow fall, and eventually an evening out. It's a great thing to see a band that is so interesting as Primus, so kind of against what you'd expect to be popular, be so popular and so beloved, if just for a few couple years or so.
I was going to say, I know this one is very important to you. Primus is very important to you, and I've really enjoyed listening to Pork Soda here. I was more familiar with Sailing the Seas of Cheese. I think Pork Soda is a darker album, and I think it's particularly fitting for Halloween. So let's jump right into the actual album itself and actually talk about it. The first little track here, I have to tell you, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know if it's necessary for the album to start off with Pork Chop's little ditty, because it reappears later, and it's very short, and it's sort of jaunty and piratey in a way. But I don't know if it's really worth talking about until we get to the actual song itself, and even then I'd say it's probably sort of one of the weakest things on here.
It's a little kind of a weird bookending thing that they chose to do here, but I mean, I guess it does in some ways kind of prepare you for some sounds that you're going to hear later on in the album. That banjo is going to return at some point. My Name Is Mud. And, Les Claypool was a famous bassist, and he was influenced by famous bassists like Roger Waters and John Paul Jones. And I think the most important to mention in terms of influences was Larry Graham. Larry Graham was a bassist and a kind of band leader. He played with Sly and the Family Stone, and he's most famous for inventing a style of bass playing called slapping, or the slap bass technique. Prior to this, bassists would usually use a pick, as regular guitarists do, or they would use their fingers, and that style of playing produces a specific style of sound. If you've ever listened to a bass around that time, say by Paul McCartney or whatever, it has a specific sound that you're kind of familiar with. The slap bass technique refers to, it's kind of, the name is kind of the description. You use your thumb or your hand to kind of strike the string, which produces a kind of much louder percussive sound. And Les Claypool usually joins that with something that I always heard called popping, which is to kind of, you slap the bass, the kind of lower strings with your thumb, and you pick at the lighter or the higher strings with your hand to kind of create two different kind of percussive sounds, a lower percussive sound and a higher percussive sound. And I bring that up because My Name Is Mud is that slap bass technique. It is kind of the rumbling bass that was so kind of distinct for Primus at the time.
I feel that's a very accurate description. There's that sort of, I don't even know how to do it. If you can't tell from my voice, I'm not feeling particularly well right now, but that sort of it's so unlike anything else really of its time that it's great. And it really feeds into the Halloween theme. I don't know what it is about the slap bass, and you did a great job covering it. It works wonderfully here. I mean, it gives you such an ominous tone, and it works perfectly on Pork Soda. There's a few songs, honestly, and we'll get to them on Pork Soda, that I don't think quite feed into the Halloween theme the way I'd want them to, but this one totally hits this out of the park.
Yeah, I mean, just the opening tone is just like this Les Claypool's kind of low bass note that kind of drops you into. It's as an evocative a sound to me as the drum wind up to the first track of Loveless, or Tony Iommi's opening 3 notes on the Black Sabbath album. When I hear that one note, and then you get into rumbling bass. It is so great to me. As a song, really kind of gets you into what the band was known for as well. The kind of thundering bass of Claypool, the pounding drums of Herb Alexander, and Larry Lalonde, despite being a guitar virtuoso, he's not really in the forefront as far as sounds go. He's much more a atmospheric piece.
You know, it takes a real virtuoso to understand their place, and I think maybe that's really Lalonde's great triumph, is that he's able to just sort of texture the bass of Claypool. If it wasn't for that, I often wonder, I mean, you have to have that if you're going to have someone like Claypool doing these sort of so absurdly weird bass lines.
I mean, it does kind of give credence to the description of Primus as a funk metal band, because funk as a musical genre does emphasize kind of bass lines and drums being on the forefront and guitars kind of taking a step back. So if you wanted to make an argument for Primus being funk metal, this is a song that kind of puts you in the mood for that argument. This is also a song that kind of deals with one of Claypool's favorite songwriting subjects, which is rednecks and blue-collar people. My Name Is Mud is referring to a man named Aloysius Devidander Abercrombie, who, in an argument with another man, murders him, and he is now burying the dead body. Just to hear Claypool kind of break out his weird southern twang on this song, it really makes you understand that this is not a normal kind of band. Like, this one's a weird one. I'm not sure what Claypool's interest in kind of rednecks are anyway, because he's from California. I don't know how strong the redneck community is in California, but
I love that last line. So I kissed him upside the cranium with an aluminum baseball bat. That'll get you in the mood for sort of the Halloween spirit here. But I love that sort of the payoff line to why he's burying the body.
Just a really kind of heavy, dark, beautiful song that I've loved since the moment I've heard it. And if you hear it, you can tell why. It's just really fun to listen to. We move on from My Name Is Mud to a song which kind of seems to me like it should have been the first song you hear because of the title, Welcome to This World. A song that kind of deals with another kind of one of Claypool's interests, which is bizarre places. He likes to build tiny little worlds that characters kind of interact with. And Welcome to This World kind of describes a place of pink champagne and swimming pools, and all you have to lose there is your virginity. Bacchanalia type situations.
It almost makes you wonder, and you had noted their earlier success with Sailing the Seas of Cheese that went gold. This album also did very well and went gold eventually. It makes you wonder if when they started to become famous, the song was written and sort of Les Claypool's introduced to a new world that he doesn't really know what to make of. But it's a world of sort of fame and excess and everything else, and I love this sort of meandering bass line here as well. I mean, you get I said skittering is probably the word that I really like to describe Claypool's bass, but here in particular, it sort of meanders around, and he sort of frantically blurts out these sort of lyrics. I really enjoy that. I find this to be almost, when listening to it, I was brought to mind of the band XTC. There's a certain vocal delivery that's very similar between the two.
Well, that's interesting that you should mention that, because on one of their later EPs, Rhinoplasty, they actually did cover an XTC song, Making Plans for Nigel. So
love that track. That is a wonderful track.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously he was aware of XTC at the time. I'm not sure what technique he's using here. It might just be finger picking. He might actually be striking the frets with his hand, which is something he would often do. Kind of another bit of sound you can get out of the bass. But kind of this weird kind of skittering, almost polka-esque or circus-type music that kind of drops into just straight-up head-banging mosh metal stuff. And it's really interesting. It's a very kind of off-kilter song. I think with My Name Is Mud, you kind of had this good solid rocker, but this isn't despite being how heavy it is, it's not really a rocker. It kind of puts you in a more paranoid mood than My Name Is Mud does, but obviously it fits in with the darker themes of Pork Soda. And I should mention, this album was intentionally made to be a darker album. We're not just kind of putting words in the band's mouth when we chose this for Halloween. This album, before it was recorded, Primus had been on a very long and exhausting tour. I believe they played with Rush, they played with Fishbone, a lot of kind of different bands during the early 90s. And when they came back to the studio after touring, they were, as you might expect, tired and burnt out. And so they made an album to reflect their kind of feelings on that matter. And it definitely showed. Moving on to track number 4, Bob is a song about suicide. There's no way around it. The first line in the song is, I had a friend that took a belt and hung himself. Obviously, I'm a person who's kind of been open about kind of my feelings on that, and I can't say that a song about suicide in that way didn't kind of draw the young, angsty me towards this album in some ways, but it is a very interesting song. Band does some kind of like weird bluesy kind of thing. The bass line really lurches back and forth, and Lalonde's guitar squeals in the background as it usually does. It's a very kind of slow-paced song, a very heavy song, not only in terms of music, but in lyrical tones.
This is almost a headbanger, isn't it? I was surprised by that. I mean, there's a certain level at which it's, yeah, you could sort of see yourself like with your long locks of hair in the 90s sort of just headbanging to this track when the chorus kicks in. I like that a lot. This song is perfect as part of, again, that Halloween theme. I just love how dark it is, too. You really don't hear anything else, even this, so full frontal in talking about suicide. I mean, that's repeated constantly. I had a friend that took a belt, and hung himself. Repeatedly. Just that's the main theme here. And it almost, it's weird. You almost can sort of get inside this weird macabre mindset where I don't even know how to say it. It's not fun or funny in any way, but it's sort of taking in that terrible event and reforming it and sort of just living in it. It's mesmerizing in so many ways.
Bluesy, almost maybe even like reggae in some ways, kind of that drop beat. But yeah, it's weird that an album that reached number 7 on the Billboard rock charts kind of has a song that's so frank about suicide. And there have been songs that tackle suicide before. The one that springs immediately to mind is I Think I'm Going to Kill Myself by Elton John off of his album Honky Chateau. But in that manner, it was a more, I guess you could say, upbeat song, a bit more geared toward comedy as kind of a thing that the narrator is singing about in order to gain attention. But in this album with Bob, it's not really treated positively or negatively. I mean, he mentions in the song, that one friend thought they were spiteful, and Larry Lalonde, thought him pitiful, and Les himself has just never been back to the apartment where Bob lived. So it's very strange because it's not expressly condemning suicide. It is more like kind of making mention of the lingering feelings towards it and kind of just the aftermath in some ways of the event. But yeah, very good song. Gets really kind of hard and heavy during the kind of chorus sections.
I love the ending too, where it just sort of this sort of like blah blah blah. He stops singing the lyrics and just starts making sounds at the end because it's so primal that he sort of lost the actual vocal, and it just becomes this sort of chant, this sort of mantra that's just like you don't even need the words for blah 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 blah. It's sort of fascinating. I love that delivery. I think that honestly is, and you see it throughout this album, one of the most absolutely underrated things about Primus is the lyrics, how absurd they are, and the delivery of Claypool is so unique and so fun to me, even when it's talking about such a terrible subject.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the kind of major pros that Primus had as a band compared to their competitors. Anthony Kiedis, he's a he's a great singer, but that's what he does. He sings. He doesn't really explore any kind of different ranges. He doesn't really try anything different than what works for him. Faith No More is a little bit better in that regard. Obviously, Mr. Bungle would be even better later on, but yeah, Primus is not a thing, I guess. Claypool loves conversational tones. He loves kind of weird vocal deliveries. I think that's kind of what made Primus so recognizable, is that this is a band that's not attempting to be a regular band. Great song. Moving on to DMV, which in terms of musicality is very similar to Jerry Was a Race Car Driver. It's very much based around kind of this clean kind of tapping-based bass line that Claypool was doing. And otherwise, and generally speaking, the rest of it is very similar to that sound of Jerry Was a Race Car Driver, kind of pounding drums, this tapping bass line, obviously Lalonde's atmospheric guitar. And it's a song about how bad the DMV is. You have to tell me, Beeves, because generally speaking, I don't often go to the DMV all that much because I don't drive. But have you ever just wanted to have sex with a chimpanzee rather than go to the DMV?
Which I love. That's the last line of the song, by the way. I love that. I love Lalonde's guitar here. It's kind of this squeal that really accentuates the bass. It's perfectly placed. It's kind of hard if I were a musician as a guitarist, I'd kind of find that kind of hard to find that groove, but he finds it so well. So, interesting story about the DMV. My mother basically works at a state's equivalent of the DMV. It's not called the DMV. It has other initials. So I have quite a good rapport with that. My mother works worked for many years on the Tella side of the DMV. I honestly, the DMV does suck, as people know, as almost anyone knows. I've lucked out every time I've gone to the DMV. I've been in and out in probably 30 to 40 minutes. Most people bitch and moan about being there an hour and a half, 2 hours. Maybe I've just been lucky. I just try to be nice. I think that's the real key. Like, if you go to a DMV, just whatever you do, expect to spend the next 2 hours of your life there. And if you get out in under 2 hours, you need to consider it a roaring success. Go celebrate however you like, whether it's by, as Dale Cooper would say, a slice of cherry pie and a hot cup of coffee, or other means. You should certainly do so, because you just need to expect that it's going to be hell. But I love this track, though. This is another, I love the beginning of this album. It's so good. It's so hits the nail on the head. This isn't as Halloween-y, but it's still a little weird. It's weird enough to sort of feed into the experience. I love it. I just think it's a great continuation. This is on They Can't All Be Zingers as one of their greatest hits, and it should be, and it's awesome. I love it.
It's a song about how bad going to the DMV is in one regard. And at the same time, it's a song about apathy. In the song, Les Claypool sings, "When I need relief, I spell it THC. Perhaps you may know vaguely what I mean. I sit back and smoke away huge chunks of memory as I slowly inflict upon myself a full lobotomy."
I often wonder, is he saying that even a trip to the DMV is like a lobotomy as well? It's like you almost need to be high in order to get past this.
Well, I mean, he kind of getting high in that way as pointless. And he also refers to kind of the unpleasantries of life, like cold toilet seats, dentist chairs, and trips to the DMV as pointless. So it's a song that really kind of speaks to an apathy that I think was a popular subject in the early 90s. There was just a level of apathy that was kind of so popular in popular music. Obviously, and she got a lot of mileage out of feelings of apathy.
What was the Simpsons line? There's a famous line from their Hollapalooza episode where I think Bart there's some part where Bart says, what is it, like making teenagers depressed is like shooting fish in a barrel. I think that fits nicely in there.
And a great song. And we move on to The Old Diamondback Sturgeon, Fisherman Chronicles Part 3. The last part of Primus's fish-based song trilogy. It started with John the Fisherman way back on Frizzle Fry and Suck on This. Was continued on Selling the Seas of Cheese with Fish On. And now we've kind of reached the coda of the Chronicles with The Old Diamondback Sturgeon. A song about as you might expect, an old diamondback sturgeon who is swimming along one day and is caught. And we kind of see through the song his struggles before he's eventually captured. And this is a kind of a strange one. Musically and lyrically, it doesn't really fit with the rest of the album if you consider it the darker Primus album. Although I guess if you were a fish, being caught is pretty scary. But musically, it's very different as well. Musically, it brings to mind the actual rolling waves of the sea. Like, just to hear the way the drums work and how the bass line goes. There's all of these qualities of kind of waving back and forth, sound crashing upon the tides in that way. But at the same time, it sounds almost simple, but to actually see it in practice, you'd think you could never do that in a million years. Because it sounds like so quick, and there's like so many kind of different notes packed into that little riff. It's fascinating to think about. It's like how often Les Claypool manages to like make incredibly intricate like chord progressions, I guess, or bass lines, and just make it sound so easy and so simple.
I kind of find this song, you'll have to excuse me, I don't particularly care for it too much. I think it's really unique. I don't dislike it. I just don't think it really fits on the album. I get that it's a continuation from each of the previous albums, the sort of the final of the trilogy, and I like the idea a lot. I just don't think it really fits on the album. That would be my only comment here. I kind of feel like it breaks up a little bit of the Halloween vibe a little bit, but it's a decent song. It's just, I'll be honest, it's really not my cup of tea.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. And like Les Claypool is at his most twangy in this song as well. Like, he gets really deep into that southern twang on this song too. But I guess since I've listened to this album since I was in in high school, then I probably have a much stronger love for it. I'm able to kind of not able to break from that love. So I'll always pick the old diamondback sturgeon. Moving on to the second half or so of the album, we have Nature Boy, a song that is similar in makeup to a song that we'll hear later on in the album, but is based around very stompy, pounding drum sequence, very kind of simple bass line and simple bass and guitar setup. The song itself is about the Nature Boy, which is basically a man who likes to walk around naked in his own house. Personally, I don't really have a huge connection with Nature Boy song. I think it's one of the more kind of normal by the numbers rockers on the album. I do like that they name drop Ren and Stimpy in this song though, and just the return of the name Aloysius as well. The Nature Boy's cat is named Aloysius, but although I should say right around midway to the song or near the end, it kind of moves from this rocker kind of thing into they jumped up the tempo 3 or 4 times, and just they turn into this strange, almost surf mambo kind of thing, surf rock mambo rock number. That's the part of the song that I really like. Just it's like you're falling headlong into a ravine, and the wind's blowing past your face, and you just have this heavy rock moment before it kind of levels back up into normality.
I like this one a lot. I see, though, I agree with you. It's sort of normal in that you could see other bands doing this. You could tell me this was Primus, and I'd be like, okay. But if some other band did this, I wouldn't be shocked. It does sort of have very more normal sounding. You're right about the ending as well. I like how it sort of picks up. It's a very fun, rocker, more upbeat ending. This is a great little track. I don't know if it really fits with the whole Halloween theme, but it's a lot of fun, and I think it fits on the album well.
We move on to Wounded Knee, which I believe Tim Alexander, this song, he specifically mentions the massacre at Wounded Knee back in the olden times and he said that this song was built to be a reference to that. Starts off very kind of calmly, some light bottle work, hitting some bottles, very kind of calm, that kind of turns dark and always kind of menacing. A little bit of marimba too. Call back way to Captain Beefheart in his Magic Band. Yeah, kind of a instrumental break, kind of giving you a breather from what Nature Boy was doing. On into another kind of weird, non-proper track, Pork Soda, which features Les Claypool on the double bass, kind of doing these weird, almost wheezing lines on the bass. I don't know how to describe it, like clockwork guitar and drums. Like it has almost like you're rearing back and it's letting go and kind of snapping back into place, like piece to piece. As Les Claypool kind of rambles on about, and at the same time he's doing a commercial for Pork Soda, you'll be feeling just fine. Ain't nothing quite like sitting around the house swilling down them cans of swine. Maybe the weirdest track, just because you'd expect from the title track to, get a proper song. And instead you get this weird bit of Residence-like audio comedy. As a title track, it does kind of put you in the right mindset that you have to be in to enjoy this album, I think. Move on from Pork Soda into The Pressman.
I just want to say about Pork Soda, I actually agree with you. I like Pork Soda a lot. This is one of my favorites.
Not really standout, like My Name Is Mud or Welcome to This World, but still good song. I do like the kind of bass of this song, or the structure of this song, though. Lyrically, it is about a pressman, I guess, a newspaper reporter who's kind of locked himself in his room and is trying to create, I'll take skies of blue, turn over skies of gray. I write between the lines. I deal with fantasy. Unfortunately, unlike Nature Boy, he doesn't really have a moment where the band just gets to let loose and there's this great moment. It kind of stays static the whole way through. It's an okay song, but it's not a favorite.
I have to say, of the previous songs, I really loved Pork Soda a lot, the song. I love how it is sort of a commercial and just sort of the stream of consciousness and everything else that is done on that song is just wonderful. I love Claypool and every facet of that song. I think it fits on the album. Again, very well, good for the Halloween theme. I like the Pressman a lot as far as the Halloween theme goes. There is this sort of pounding low suspense to it that sort of works throughout it. I think you're right. I think it's a little long. It's a little over 5 minutes, so it goes on a little too long, but I love the atmosphere, and I actually like the sound a lot. I think it's perfect for this album. Love it. We move on to the next one, Mr. Crinkle. I'm not a big of a fan of this one. What are your thoughts, Jacob?
Well, a little bit of history about Mr. Crinkle. It is one of the 3 songs, I believe, on Pork Soda that actually did get a music video. But as you'll hear it from Les Claypool, MTV never played video to this song, except for maybe 6 or 7 times, despite the amount of work that he actually put into the video to this song. Interesting musically, Les Claypool finally breaks out the double bass for a full song. How to describe it? It's very kind of a simple bass line, but it's very heavy. It's almost heavier than what you'd hear on an electric bass. Just this kind of cutting, digging bass line as a kind of the guitar fades and screeches along in the background with these kind of, I want to say it's like slightly produced drums here, because it always reminds me of it always puts me into mind that the drums are like being produced in a different environment, because it's very kind of echoey drums that kind of hit in the background. And the song itself, or lyrically, I've heard it that this song was written with Glenn Danzig in mind, that this is supposed to be kind of a dig on Danzig in some ways. But Mr. Crinkle is this strange person who seems to be rich. He seems to have just a fan of something, who has his team move away. It's kind of hard to say what Mr. Crinkle is supposed to be. Perhaps just a dude that Les Claypool knows, that he's kind of talking about the day with. How the baseball or football team is moving away. Have you heard this brand new sound? It's a cross between Jimi Hendrix, Bocephus, Cher, and James Brown. It's a weird little song, like a weird little kind of instrumentation and a weird music video, which involves Les Claypool in a pig mask playing the bass as the camera slowly swivels across very weird and surreal scenes. It's just like a very surreal song, I guess, is the main thing I want to say about that. But I just love the sound, I guess, of the double bass. It doesn't seem like like it has like quite like the range as the electric bass does, obviously, but the volume of the double bass is what really makes this song, kind of the hard cutting sound of it. Move on from Mr. Crinkle into The Air is Getting Slippery, a song based around not only the double bass, I think makes a return. You have Larry Lalonde on the banjo. It's a Primus drinking song, I guess. If Primus ever opened a pub, this is the song that they would play. Everyone would have their mugs and tankers out, and this is the song here. Of a song that's built around not saying curse words. I'm here to make a buck, and those that cannot take the heat can take a flying forgive me if I hesitate. It's incredibly hot in here today. Incredibly hot in here. It's a song that references Primus's musical interests. If you'd studied your Floyd properly, you'd know that pigs could fly. Now, if you want an encore, you might hear Is It Luck, which is a song that featured on Sailing the Seas of Cheese. But me, I'd rather play Residence because I don't give a forgive me if I hesitate. It's a song that really kind of digs into the Primus aesthetic. You have bands like Pink Floyd and the Residents. You have rednecks who sell meth. It's a very popular Claypool subject. It's a very kind of simple and dumb song, but I've always found myself loving it because of how simple and dumb it is.
You know, the lyrics I can really appreciate, but this, for me, to be honest with you, is sort of where the album loses me. If the album would have ended with Mr. Crinkle, I would have thought this thing as a whole would be just so tight and really great. The aesthetic would be complete to me, and I could walk away and be like, I don't know what that runtime is through Mr. Crinkle, but it's long enough for me to go, that's a full album, and I'm very happy with it. It's here on this track, though, on The Air is Getting Slippery, that I sort of find it's outside of what the rest of the album is. And then you go on from that to Hamburger Train, which is this almost sort of fish / I don't even know where to begin, freak out of a song that I'm not a big fan of. I just kind of find it to be a bit much. It's a bit masturbatory for me. I'm kind of curious of your thoughts there, Jacob, because I think you're going to have a different take, and I kind of want to know what it is.
Well, I guess to kind of address the previous point of like the album ending at Mr. Crinkle, I can understand that idea if we kind of view it from the idea that there's a running theme of the album that it's supposed to be dark, or in our case, it's supposed to be like Halloween. I can understand that. If you removed everything past Mr. Crinkle, it'd kind of be a bit of a short album. I think it'd be like 45 minutes or so long.
Be okay. I think that's a decent running album. You can even throw Hail Santa on there. I actually like that one a lot too, just as an atmospheric closer. It's weird and scary enough to work to. So I could throw that one on there as well.
Yeah. So the album with the tracks is still not that long of an album. It clocks in at about 57 minutes and 40 seconds. So it's not going to take up too much of your day. But in terms of like the darkness and like the darker themes that you kind of understand with that we've been talking about throughout this episode about what Pork Soda is supposed to be, The Air is Getting Slippery kind of denotes a slight change. You know, they've gotten the songs out, and now they're just kind of having a little bit of fun with it, I guess. They're kind of letting loose, letting their hair down. The last proper song of the album, Hamburger Train, is a track that I often find myself not listening to all that often. When I listen through this album, I'll usually kind of avoid Hamburger Train. It's an interesting track. It actually, the opening where the person says, you guys are from the Hamburger Train, right, is actually a line from Cheech and Chong's Nice Dreams. Paul Rubens, otherwise known as Pee Wee Herman, actually says that. And I believe the context of that line is Cheech and Chong are at a restaurant with Paul Rubens and some other woman, and Cheech and Pee Wee kind of duck under the table to do coke. And I think around that point, he utters the famous line. Kind of a weird little opening to what is basically just Primus getting their instrumental juices out. It's a song that kind of like the old Diamondback Sturgeon kind of is built to evoke a certain thing. The kind of the drums and the bass of that song kind of reminded you of a angry tossing ocean, and this one is very much built to sound like a train, kind of very even bass line, rolling drums, very much is a train song. I mean, in terms of a song, of kind of where it places in the album, it's kind of just Primus is just like indulging in a jam. Would eventually kind of be the direction that the band took later on. Tales from the Punch Bowl also features this mindset of kind of long instrumental tracks. Over the Electric Grapevine is one of those songs. Southbound Pachyderm, I think, is very much in the same way. So in the context of the band, I can understand it, kind of what they were doing, what they would be doing later on, and like their influences like Rush and so on. But I will say that it's not a song that I turn to all that often. So Hamburger Train is pretty much the last song of the album, I guess you could say. And the last two tracks are something of a bookend. We opened with Pork Chop's Little Ditty, and we kind of end with Pork Chop's Little Ditty, the full track, which is basically just almost a folkish or Celtic folk kind of thing. Banjos, drums, stomping, all that thing that you remember, which ends, kind of fades out. And then we get something of a hidden track. It feels like it was supposed to be a hidden track. I don't know if the advent of CDs had kind of ruined hidden tracks by that point, but we get track number 15, Hail Santa. Feels like a fever dream when you listen to it. It's got kind of Les Claypool's bass is melting. You got some bicycle bells going on, and you got this weird kind of children's toy saying, "This is a pig." Oink, oink, oink. So kind of lets you know that you think you're safe, and then Santa's is coming for you. You mentioned that you liked Hail Santa earlier, Beeves. You want to give a little thoughts to the last couple tracks?
Pork Chop's Little Ditty to me is like, it's fine, like in sort of almost the Sailing the Seas of Cheese sound. It just doesn't belong on this album for me. I think there are a few songs that don't do it for me. Like, I want this album to be like that perfect, dark, angular kind of Primus experience. And there's a few songs that ruin it for me, and that's one of them. Because I just have these ideas that it should be this perfect little thing, and that's probably not good for, obviously, my idea of what should be perfect is obviously not what, they have to do or should do for any reason. But I just want it to be that perfect, cohesive whole. And I feel like Hail Santa is kind of like a nice little, as you said, fever dream of an end is the perfect way to describe it, because this is atmospheric little dark sounding sort of thing that could fit nicely in my imagination of this great, skim the cream off the top of pork soda. But I have to say, this album as a whole, if I could cut it up how I want it to be, it would be I think it would be awesome to be probably 40, 45 minutes. And that would be more than, I think, long enough for a great album, a great experience that you walk away from going, holy shit, what was that? That was great. As it is, there's so much good stuff on here. Obviously, I'm going to recommend it. Obviously, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed a lot of what I heard. But I can't help but just want it to be the perfect little concoction that I've made in my mind. Jacob, I'll let you close out since Primus is so very important to you. This album is one that you really love. I'll let you close out with your thoughts here, and we'll take it home and end her, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, everyone has got a very clear idea of how I feel about Primus. This is a band that's been very close to my heart for many years. And Pork Soda has been an album that's been close to my heart for years as well. As much as the cholesterol would be close to my heart if I actually drank Pork Soda. Pork Soda, despite being kind of the highlight commercially of the band, aside from when known as Big Brown Beaver, it's, along with Frizzle Fry and Sailing the Seas of Cheese and Tales from the Punch Bowl, creates some of the strongest material that you could find in the early 90s for music. I think it kind of captures a sense of surreality and wonder and bizarreness that kind of music was trying to grasp for in that time, that labels and corporations, everything, were trying to get for themselves and kind of exploit. It was just a great time for music. And Primus was the great figurehead for that campaign for weird music. I mean, they took the They took the mindset of Frank Zappa and the Residents of the 70s, and they took the weirdness and darkness of metal from the 80s, and they made a new thing for it. And now, these days, they've explored music through festivals and jam bands and kind of psychedelic stuff. And it's like I said, it's so great to see them continuing their success. And I don't know if I'll ever not love Primus. Primus may suck, but Primus will also always be great in my eyes. That does it for our special super spooky Halloween edition of the Albums Only podcast. Next week we'll be getting back into the normal schedule with whatever album will go at that time. Check us out or contact us. You can follow us on Twitter at Albums Only. You can also send us an email at albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. We are on SoundCloud as well as YouTube and perhaps something else in the near future. You never know. We got a whole bunch of irons in the fire. You never can tell. Yeah, that'll do it for this week. I hope you have a great Halloween. Hope you watch a whole bunch of spooky movies and eat a whole bunch of fattening candy and just have a great old time, because it seems like these days Halloween just doesn't get the respect it deserves. But before we go, since this is a Halloween episode, what are you planning to do for Halloween, Beeves?
You know, me and the girlfriend, we always carve pumpkins. We're going to probably watch some good scary movies. We want to check out The Babysitter on Netflix. This part will not age well, by the way. If you listen to this 2 or 3 years in the future, this will all sound silly. But we'll probably check that out. There's some other ones. I think there's one called Hush on Netflix that we're going to check out. We're just going to watch some the classic horror movies and carve some pumpkins and eat some pumpkin seeds and have a good time. You, Slate?
Yeah, I'll probably be watching a lot of movies. If you need some Halloween movie recommendations, I would say the first 3 Frankenstein movies from Universal are very good. John Carpenter's The Thing, obviously. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, very good. And for some some modern stuff, Get Out was actually very interesting. I actually really enjoyed that one. We're going to be enjoying our Halloweens. Hope you enjoy your Halloween too, and we'll see you next week. Bye, folks.